vision of the future. 21st century cities in the sky, with shuttle service to Earth. The picture of international cooperation. But the technology that will make this possible had its roots in much darker times. It was the Nazis who first developed the rocket during World War II. Powerful missiles pointed not into space, but at cities like London. But the triumph of launching the space age fell to the Soviets. From a secret firing in Kazakhstan, a huge Vostok rocket thundered upwards. It delivered into orbit a tiny metallic sphere, the world's first man-made satellite. As Sputnik made its way around the globe, the world reeled. It was October 4th, 1957. 2 months later, the Soviets launched a larger Sputnik into orbit, this time with a passenger, Laika the dog. The first U.S. response to the Soviet challenge never got off the ground, and the search for a new design was on. Meanwhile, in strictest secrecy, Soviet technicians prepared this capsule. Its purpose? To carry the first man into space. April 12, 1961. Atop 4 strap-on boosters and 33 engines, the capsule was hurled aloft. The objective, one Earth orbit. The passenger, test pilot Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin. Had the mission failed, the world might never have known. The media blackout was total. But Gagarin made it, and the world marveled. 23 days later, the Americans responded. A puny Redstone rocket lobbed Alan Shepard into a 15-minute suborbital hop. Stunned by the Soviet lead, President Kennedy announced that the U.S. would place a man on the moon before the decade was out. The Soviets countered with the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. But the Mercury program made seasoned orbiters of the Americans as well. The last Mercury flight splashed down in 1963 after completing 22 orbits. NASA announced the two-man Gemini series. Again, the Soviets stole the show, cramming 3 men into a capsule built for 2, with no room for spacesuits or ejector seats. And a few months later, Alexei Leonov became the first man to walk in space. It was 1965. The Soviets had done it again. But with the Gemini program, the U.S. shrugged off Soviet triumphs and concentrated on preparations for a moon landing. This meant testing equipment, training astronauts, maneuvering in orbit. Rehearsal for the most delicate and dangerous moments in the planned lunar landing, rendezvousing and docking. On Gemini 4, Ed White became the first American to walk in space. The Gemini program, the bridge between the tentative steps of Mercury and the great adventure of Apollo, ended in 1966. later, Apollo 11 headed for the moon. On July 20, 1969, the spindly lander module dropped towards the unknown.
Forward. That's 40 feet down, 2.5.
Aboard were astronauts Armstrong and Aldrich.
4 forward, drift into the right a little. That's 8. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
We copy you down, Eagle.
President Kennedy's pledge was fulfilled.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
With just 5 months left in the decade, they'd made it.
That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind.
Millions watched on television. What only a handful knew was that a Soviet probe had crashed at the same time.
Amazing Space will return on TLC. Amazing Space now continues on TLC.
As the lander module Eagle triumphantly returned the first men on the moon to lunar orbit, NASA knew that a rival craft had crashed. This Soviet robot had smashed into the lunar surface while Eagle was landing. Only after the breakup of the Soviet Union were its lunar ambitions revealed. Original plans called for this rocket, bigger than Apollo 11's Saturn, to put a man on the moon in one powerful shot. A cosmonaut would have had to spacewalk his way to a lunar lander, a scheme all the more hazardous for being a solo mission. The Soviets hoped to put a man on the moon in 1968, a year ahead of NASA. But the death of Sergei Korolev, the visionary of their space program, meant it was the Americans who had the run of the place. The 6 Apollo landings were more political than scientific undertakings, but the astronauts obligingly collected dust and rock for study. Years later, these analyses would hint at a cataclysmic origin for the moon, a collision between a young Earth and another would-be planet. Moon rock analyses also confirmed that water and oxygen could be produced from lunar soil. That meant self-supporting moon bases would be possible, even if it might take a while to learn how to keep your footing in 1/6 gravity. Homeward bound. By the time the program was over, Apollo missions had conveyed 29 men to the moon and back again. 12 had walked on its surface. But those heady days were soon over. NASA had spent billions of dollars on the Apollo program, and the U.S. was fighting an expensive war in Vietnam. The last Apollo splashed down in the Pacific in 1972. Since then, nobody has returned to the moon. NASA concentrated Apollo's leftovers on Skylab, an Earth-orbiting space station built from the tank of a Saturn rocket. Astronauts and scientists spent more than 500 days aboard this celestial laboratory. Meanwhile, the Soviets were busy aboard Salyut, a whole series of successful space stations. Soviet crews spent months in orbit. They proved the human body could survive prolonged periods of weightlessness. Soon, the Europeans joined the act. A joint effort by France, Germany, and Britain brought them into the space age. Today it's become a 13-nation European space agency. Here an Ariane launcher blasts off from French Guiana. Ariane has proved reliable and commercial, efficiently delivering a stream of satellites into orbit. In 1981. NASA had put all its resources behind a radical alternative to the rocket. The Space Shuttle. It marked the launch of a new cost-conscious era in manned spaceflight. The Space Shuttle went up like a rocket, orbited like a spaceship, and landed like an aircraft. The all-in-one, reusable space vehicle. The Soviets' entire Salyut space station would have fit inside the shuttle's massive cargo bay. In theory, the shuttle crew should have been able to launch satellites, do repairs, and make pickups easily from the huge bay. Reality proved a different matter. There were hitches and delays, and keen competition for satellite launches from Ariane. But the shuttle had much to offer. For a crew of up to 7, there was space to live, to work, to set up experiments, and to have fun. Compared with the cramped conditions of earlier vehicles, the Space Shuttle was a cruise ship. By the mid-'80s, the program's future looked bright. Few realized that the shuttle was a disaster waiting to happen.
Amazing Space will return on TLC. Amazing Space now continues on TLC.
January 28, 1986. As the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off, hopes for the program ran high. Then, a fuel seal gave way. All 7 aboard were killed. The Space Shuttle was grounded for 4 years. When it did fly again, it was a strengthened vehicle with a lighter schedule. To some, it was still a prototype. To others, a stepping stone to future missions, like the construction of a vast multinational space station. But while such projects are still on the drawing board, another orbiter has been busy for years. A workshop in the sky. It is the Soviet station Mir, meaning peace. Assembled module by module since 1986. Soviet crews commuted to Mir by Soyuz ferry. Foreigners participated and lucrative commercial contracts rolled in. A link-up with the American Space Shuttle was planned. Mir was so successful it survived the demise of the Soviet Union. The Soviet version of the Space Shuttle Buran did not fare as well. Pictured here on the back of the world's most powerful rocket, Energia, Buran flew by remote control. Lifted into orbit by Energia, Buron had one unmanned flight and a doubtful future. Instead, the Russians may lend a hand with a planned European shuttle, Hermes, pictured here with its mini space station, Columbia Free Flyer. A joint venture with the European Space Agency is a possibility. The Japanese are also interested in a manned mini shuttle. The space shuttle will remain NASA's orbital workhorse, perhaps helping to construct a great space station, Freedom. Freedom might look something like this. A collection of bolt-on modules, American, European, Japanese, even Russian, and orbiting United Nations permanently manned. The space shuttle will be invaluable, but may prove too small to ferry the heaviest parts aloft. Its successor will probably look something like this, a super shuttle. Half aircraft, half spacecraft. A space plane that could travel from New York to Australia in 45 minutes, or from airport to spaceport in less than half an hour. Someday it may ferry us to vacation spots in the sky, perhaps not by 2001, but sooner than you might think. A weekend break, watching the Earth below and the heavens above. It's science fiction today, but a likely reality in the next century. In the more immediate future, we may want to set our sights on a manned return to the moon, last visited in 1972. A manned lunar landing should be much easier in the 21st century than it was in the 20th, but still a challenge. With old rivalries buried, NASA hopes for an international effort. A lunar base would be a first priority. With the space shuttle as a kickstart, NASA has longer-term plans for a manned mission to Mars. Technologically, such a trip is already feasible. Cost is the problem. Initially, astronauts would touch down on the tiny moon of Phobos. There, they'd set up a sort of base camp. Meanwhile, using the thin Martian atmosphere as a brake, a lander would descend to the red planet itself. Mars represents an enormous undertaking. The round trip from Earth would take 2 years and vast resources. Mars is cold and arid, its air unbreathable. Building airtight shelters would be the first step in establishing a permanent presence. Explorers would wear pressurized suits and carry oxygen backpacks. They'd drive Martian rovers. They'd search for water, possibly trapped as ice beneath the surface. Water would prove invaluable, a source of oxygen to breathe and hydrogen to fuel the rovers. Every possible device would be designed to make the colonies self-sustaining. After all, the nearest supplies would be a year away on Earth. NASA will probably send manned expeditions to the other inner planets, but the outer solar system will remain the preserve of robots. December 1995. The robot Galileo slots into orbit around Jupiter, completing its 6-year journey from Earth A journey too far, in conditions too harsh for a human to withstand. A little later, another mission best left to a robot. A one-way ticket to investigate a comet. And shortly after the turn of the century, a rendezvous with Saturn by the orbiter Cassini. Another odyssey unlikely as a manned flight. Beyond the planets, for now at least, we'll have to be content just to look. Through powerful instruments like the Hubble Space Telescope. Instruments that reach out to the edges of the universe and back to its beginnings.
Violence. It's one of the most severe problems plaguing our schools. But there are solutions, as you'll learn on Teacher TV. Next from TLC.